Welcome everybody here at the Bloomberg Center for Cities at Harvard University, and welcome everybody online on Zoom. We're so delighted to have you here for a special event with Professors Carvalho and Weber about inventing urban futures. My name is Jort de Jong. I'm the faculty director of the Bloomberg Center. We are a university-wide center dedicated to advancing knowledge on urban problem solving. We also work with mayors from all over the world, and we've worked with about 600 over the past 10 years. And this is where it gets even more interesting for you. If you want to be involved, want to become involved in the work of urban problem solving, we offer many opportunities to do so in summer fellowships, transition term fellowships, postgraduate fellowships. And we're quite excited to talk to you about what brings you to the world of cities. So if you're interested, please talk to anyone here on the staff, and we'll provide you with more information. What's also quite interesting, not the topic of today's conversation, but Professor Bruno Carvalho has been instrumental in creating a track for students interested in urban history and urban futures at FAS. So the conversation today will be started by Bruno Carvalho, who will give an overview of his new book, which you can see here, The Invention of the Future. It looks beautiful. I highly recommend it. It's also beautifully written. It is really a global history of modern city making. It argues that urban futures are always invented in advance, but unfold in real life quite differently. And so this is, a fast-track course in 300 years of city making around the world. So we look forward to hearing about that. And then we're so excited to have Professor Rachel Weber, who is the faculty chair of the Master in Urban Planning at the Graduate School of Design, as well as a professor there in political economy, and the author of many books about finance and housing and how the political economy of the built environment shapes what cities are like. So we couldn't have a better interlocutor for this conversation. We're very excited to have them here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bruno Carvalho and Professor Rachel Weber.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you to everyone here at the Bloomberg Center. Thank you, Jort, for that kind, warm introduction. Rachel, it's an honor to be in conversation with you. Much appreciated. And thank you all for being here. So this will be a bit different from all the other book talks I've done. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, which is why I have a script. Make sure I stick to it. Could, of course, go on for much, much longer. And it'll be different because I'm going to try to do what the center asked of me and what the title of this event promises, which is talk about lessons. Before that, something about the other part of the title of the book, The Invention of the Future. So that refers to how in the 1700s in Europe, people began to imagine and expect that the future would be very different from present and past. The future would no longer be something predetermined, shaped by divine forces, but rather something to be built by humans here on Earth. Modern cities became expressions of that, and that's the story that the book tells. So each chapter moves between these sort of panoramic, global scales, and then really focuses on case studies during major turning points in the history of city making. So we start with the reconstruction of Lisbon after an earthquake in 1755. We move to New York City's Commissioner's Plan of 1811, the Haussmannian reforms in mid-19th century Paris, Rio de Janeiro and its own Osmanization in the early 20th century, Buenos Aires as a site of competing metropolitan modernist plans in the 1920s and 30s. And then we move to post-war suburbia, Brasilia, Lagos. So in these 3 centuries, very, very broad strokes, there's this sort of arc towards a confidence in the human ability to shape the built environment. The future is to be pursued. Around a century ago, the future increasingly becomes also something to be averted. Dreams shatter, foreclose, fracture, but continue to renew as well. And then the book ends closer to the present as the urban boom really picks up and takes off in East Asia. These 300 years of history are linked, but one sort of lesson from history is to be very cautious, is to sort of draw lessons from history at your own peril. What can we learn from precedents given today's unprecedented scales? In contemporary Lagos, there are 2 to 3 times as many inhabitants as the entirety of the United States when the Manhattan Grid was laid out. That said, the very idea that we should be cautious about lessons does lead us to our first takeaway. Reasonable, and these are direct quotes from the book, reasonable expectations underestimate the range of potential outcomes. So at the outset, Portugal, extremely religious kingdom, after the earthquake, leads to perhaps the first ambitious, very secular plan in modern history. That's basically unfathomable, and yet it happened, right? So as a shortcut to an argument that I try to develop with much greater nuance and hopefully more elegance in the book, we can sort of try as an exercise to imagine a time machine that sends us back to any given point in this history to describe to people what was ahead for the next 10, 20 years. And I can assure you that in almost every instance, the person that describes what was ahead would be the first to be left out of a room of very serious people, right? Try going back to the Kennedy School in 2010 and describing to people the second term of a Trump presidency and imagine how they might react. I don't mean that as a knock on expertise. The book, in fact, mounts a defense of expertise in planning, but rather this should serve as a reminder that we should never assume any given set of prospects as inexorable. And I think as we engage in data-driven approaches, as many in this room do, we should always remain alert to the recurrence of unknown unknowns in modern urban history. So there's a corollary from that. Throughout modernity, diviners and futurists overestimated the predictive uses of precedents and downplayed the political power of predictions. Flight and motorized vehicles led people to assume vertical mobility. That gave oxygen to the more sort of horizontal development of garden cities. Arguably, predictions of flight are one reason why lots of visionary planners underestimated the need for parking as planning took a car-centric turn. Predictions of car growth so this is roads, highways for Amsterdam that were never in fact built. These kinds of predictions in some cases incentivized and justified investments. In other cases, they generated backlashes. Right? So predictions here sometimes become self-fulfilling, sometimes become self-defeating, but always expectations, anxieties, aspirations propel urban developments. Over and over in the book, The History of Planning, once again, as a story about unintended consequences. There's an obvious generalizable lesson about overly prescriptive plans backfiring. This is the Paris Commune, so you open up these boulevards in part to make it easier to suppress barricades. Of course, right as you begin to finish them, you have the biggest set of barricades in Parisian history. There's something else happening in this photograph, which is a story about how controlling outcomes becomes harder when modern cities function as crossroads for competing visions. So here, you have the communards, in their own words, promising to the working classes a right to the future, quote, you are masters of your destiny. And then we have another future, another appeal to the working classes' agency and self-interest, but not as citizens, rather as consumers, unintendedly, on the background, an advertisement. To the workers, novelties at exceptional prices. There's a corollary to this history of unintended consequences, which is how new technologies fulfill existing needs while generating unintended ones. Quite a valuable one for us today. Next, sometimes yesterday's solutions are today's problems. The car is the classic example of that, and we can go back to it. I would also submit participatory planning as another solution that becomes a problem when it starts to be used as a tool to entrench incumbent interests and oppose housing and so on. Cars, of course, solve all kinds of problems, including how to re-gear wartime productive capacity after World War II. These advertisements are sort of about that. And then they, of course, become drivers of ecological devastation, gridlock, raising neighborhoods, inefficient mobility systems for compact settings, and so on and so forth. So I think this historically informed understanding of solutions as always contingent can lead us to rethink a number of intuitions. One of them is the assumption that top-down is necessarily more authoritarian and less democratic than bottom-up. That's not always true historically, nor today. And then last, sometimes yesterday's problems are today's solutions, and I think the example that first comes to mind is density. Dense industrial 19th century city exposes people to overcrowding, to pollution, to diseases. Today, they can host people in sites that are healthier, diverse, dynamic, vibrant, transit-rich, energy-efficient, and so on. And I end with this image. It's a still from Fritz Lang's Metropolis from the late 1920s. Because it's a quintessential image of dystopian urban futures. And one time in the classroom, I was showing it as such, and a student raised his hand in the back and said, I wish there was something like that when I was growing up in Montana. I'll turn over to Rachel, and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruno. I will say that I loved this book. On many different levels. I loved, your love for cities really comes through. And I just felt it was a lovely way of sort of providing a more sort of humanities inflected, a more humanistic, a more kind of culturally focused kind of correlate to some of the textbook histories of urban planning. And I can't wait to teach it in classes. It's an incredibly ambitious scope. You go on this sort of 3-century romp from Brasilia and Lisbon to Paris and New York to Lagos. You really cover a lot of ground, and you have this thread of kind of questions about the history, how different eras, sort of different societies imagine the future, to show how these imaginaries have in some ways a kind of agency, and that they also are reflective of the sort of anxieties of the particular moment in which they were hatched. So each era seems to produce a slightly different kind of posture toward the city, and I found that really interesting. And it also calls into question one of the sort of key traits of modernity in modern life, which is this kind of belief in the prediction itself, the conviction that humans really can anticipate and possibly even control what lies ahead. So I loved it. The book kind of resists sort of easy lessons. There's a lot of ambiguity, I think, that you leave to the reader. And I guess I think, I'd like to just spend a little bit of time maybe pressing you on some of these questions, maybe to ask for a little bit more clarity about how we can use this book and this wonderful cultural history of cities to inform urban policy, urban planning, sort of what we do and what we teach today in contemporary urban planning programs. So you've already sort of answered the question of to what extent the past should be our guide. And in a part of the book, you quote our benefactor, Michael Bloomberg, who when he became mayor said, looking to the past doesn't do anything for the future, right? So, but then, and then sometimes it seems as if you agree with that. And other times, like the last line of the book, you say the past might not offer clear lessons, but it can be a source of forms, modes, and dreams to keep nurturing life. So, I want to kind of press you on the value of of what role the past should play. Should we all be taking more urban history classes in urban planning, or fewer? Do we want to try to inspire a kind of creativity that I will acknowledge often came from sort of blank slating it, the tabula rasa sort of model of urban planning, which many professors still try to encourage planning students to think about, is to not necessarily let the future be our guide, to not give in to sort of the path dependencies or sort of to what already is, but to have the kind of imagination and creativity to sort of think about the future. I'm just maybe to ask again, the extent to which, if you could think about, a contemporary master's degree in urban planning, to what extent should students be studying history, or should they be attempting to envision a future that is somewhat more detached from past precedent?
Well, thank you, Rachel, for the kind words and this excellent question, which I will take a couple hours to answer.
Great. We got all day. Or at least until 12:15 or 1:15.
Yeah. So I mean, the book sort of lands on the insight that the cities of the future should not necessarily be that different from the cities of the past. Now that we have antibiotics, Paris still works, and it works better than it did in the Osmanian mid-19th century as a place of sort of compact housing, a place where you can get from point A to point B with sort of an abundance of pleasant civic public spaces. Of course, the problem is that we don't have enough of Paris, right? So an argument that I land on is that we should, from a planning perspective, focus on the lowest hanging fruits, right? So we know from anyone here who rents in Cambridge will feel this in their pockets, that there's a lot more demand for walkable, transit-rich, compact living than supply. So if we meet that supply, we have all these sort of second, third order benefits, right? Environmental, social, economic, and so on and so forth. So there's an argument here that we ought to meet some sort of very basic demands, infrastructural services, water, housing, and so on, and that a lot unfolds from that we can't quite control, but that we should sort of trust that will be worthwhile. I think we do have that lesson from cultural history. Of course, if it only were so simple, right? So the book ends with sort of Vienna and Tokyo as cities that have very, very different housing models, but sort of arrive to places of relatively good systems where people pay reasonably low rents and have access to all kinds of social infrastructure. But argues that there are many pathways to that, right? You can't replicate the Vienna model if the municipality doesn't already own tons of land as Vienna had, right? You could more easily replicate, Japanese zoning, which is sort of more coordinated and centralized, and so on. So on the history side, we should try not to overlearn from history and overcorrect based on historical lessons. Which is not an argument not to study history. It's an argument to study history without a sense of possessiveness and without sort of bringing our own priors to it, right? I gave the example of participatory planning as a solution that becomes a problem, because I think it was this very sort of needed corrective to the excesses of top-down urban renewal in the United States. But then, of course, it becomes subject to elite capture, and it no longer accomplishes the goals that it was intended for, right? But rather becomes a way through which you artificially constrain supply and inflate housing properties and keep out newcomers and so on and so forth. I think there's a lesson in history to sort of loosen up our sense of what's possible. In mobility terms, for example, one thing you learn from this book is how there's a past in which this was bike country and France was car country, right? And there's a past in which experts and planners and science fiction authors and anyone who spent any time in a city could never have imagined that cars would have become as dominant as they did, simply because it made no sense as a solution to mobility in compact settings, right? The carrying capacity is too inefficient, they take too much space. And yet, it happened, right? So here, I think what history can do for us is remind us of how the range of what's possible and the range of what's probable don't always match, right? Because probability builds on data. Data definitionally refers to known knowns, to the past, and you can speculate around that, and we should speculate around that. But history is much more mysterious. It's made of intangibles. It's messier, and on the long run, set of possibilities can really become ascertainable after they happen, which hopefully instills a sense of humbleness rather than paralysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a sense of humility, I guess, when looking at
both humility and ambition, right? Unimaginable changes happen all the time. Mm-hmm. We should just be humble about our ability to predict and control.
Well, that leads me to my second question, which is, you're a little more skeptical about the value of futuring and forecasting and prediction than a lot of people in planning and policy roles, right? And we spend an awful lot of time, I teach students how to do population projections and net present value calculations, where they have to look at spreadsheets and make assumptions about what the future is. Should I stop doing that? Is there value in doing that? You say that one of the few constants in history, in the history of urbanization, is indeterminacy. Right? That predictions and plans tend to underestimate the sheer range of potential urban outcomes, which calls into question the expertise or the knowledge or the ability to engage in these kinds of attempts to read the future. So I wonder, sort of where do you stand on this? Are you like the Aymara of the Andes, who believe that the future is not ours to see, right? Yeah. That's also a line in a Que Sera, Sera, right? Yeah. Whatever will be, will be.
Lots of musical echoes in this book for those.
Or you also quote Dante, who says, and this is fascinating, that prophets should be punished, right? And they live forever, that they should live forever with their heads twisted backwards, right? The audacity, the hubris of people who try to attempt to see the future. And yet that is a very quotidian aspect to the planning and policy field. So I'm just wondering if you think that kind of prediction, forecasting is really useful only in how it reflects the present moment, reflects or refracts, or whether or not are we wasting our time teaching people in these fields how to do projections and predictive analytics and plan making?
And absolutely
where do you stand?
No, I think there's tremendous value to modeling, to prediction, and we also have to acknowledge how much we've advanced over those 300 years, right? So the story with the Aymara, there's some linguists from UCLA that wrote a paper about how in most cultures, when people refer to the future, they go like this with their hands, and when they refer to the past, they go like this. But the Aymara refer to the past and the future And they're, of course, correct. We can see the past, right? The past is what led us to the present, and the future is, as the song goes, indeed not ours to see. But if you go back, a few hundred years to the Armada with our exceptionally accurate weather prediction models, they would be completely stunned. So, in effect, we can now see the future in ways that would have been unfathomable even in the recent past. I mean, we've gotten very, very good at predicting all kinds of things, including in cities, from traffic to population to like relationship between housing starts and rents. I mean, there are all kinds of things that I think we can and should reasonably predict. If there are any economists with cultural inclinations in the rooms, I'd love to do like a long durée study of the correlations between rents and cultural effervescence. Like moments of cultural effervescence seem to flow from like rapid expansions in a housing supply, from the Harlem Renaissance to Samba in Rio to Tokyo to like Renaissance Florence and so on. So no, I think there's tremendous value. What I also think is that we should, and here history and fiction are our allies, just sit with the limits of knowledge. I think, just to name something else we can get from that I don't quite articulate explicitly in the book, but I think is very valuable, is we've gotten very, very good at articulating the value of efficiencies and optimizing. And models and prediction models are our allies in that. So that's a baby in a bathwater that we should absolutely hug and nurture and feed. But we're not quite as good at articulating the value of inefficiencies or the value of experience. That's a false binary, right? In the best of worlds, these are interdependent. Efficiencies and optimizations free up people's time for them to socialize, to hang out, to paint, to dance, to do whatever they want with their free time. But in some senses, these can be at odds too, right? What from a productivist logic is a waste of time is precisely what gives life meaning from the perspective of a person, biking around a city to work or sitting on a park bench or whatever. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, it does. I mean, there's still, I don't expect you to resolve this question. Yeah. I think among many of us, there's a question of sort of what these predictions and plans are, like what they're sort of, not to be too fluffy, but like their kind of ontological status. Like are they just sort of smoke screens or sort of empty signifiers for interest groups to pursue what they want? I mean, you show beautifully how these kinds of future imaginaries are very Eurocentric or racialized or that they kind of serve there's lots of future talk, right? And I don't know, about you, but I notice that everywhere these days, it's this future and that future. There's a lot of sort of at least discursively, there's a lot of interest in futuring and urban futures, but it's playing some kind of rhetorical role and in some ways sort of covering for a lot of other sort of politics or, that are going on.
So maybe I'll say something else. I think the answer is really depends, right? And it depends on what you're using these tools for, right? So if you're using the tools of efficiencies and optimizations to, free up people's time, fantastic. Historically, that was very clearly not the case. And I think that the more cautionary, the instances that really should give us pause tend to be ones where people started from the conclusion, right? They really wanted these models to lead them somewhere, to naturalize inequalities, to justify racial segregation or whatever it might have been. And so my sort of methodological stance is that we should always start from material conditions and then see what that does to theory. Doesn't mean theory is useless either, right? Theory can keep us more alert to, again, how the range of the possible is wider than the range of the probable. But it can lead us astray if we try to impose it on evidence and on material conditions, right? And then I think that our current tools to make sense of empirical material conditions are are just phenomenal compared to what the positivists in the late 19th century, who in some ways invented this kind of disposition, had it at their disposal.
So is there a kind of teleology of like the techniques have improved? Like maybe we can look back in history and say like, oh, can you imagine? They thought that this was going to be the future, and like no wonder their visions like did not turn out to be the case. But somehow, let's say since the 1950s, or the revolution in computing or predictive analytics, like our tools have gotten better, and therefore we stand a better chance of anticipating the future. Or are these projections still sort of plagued by the same problems, hubris? Overconfidence, the, maybe even kind of the social biases that get sort of wrapped in like, the kind of, this is Nate Silver, right, who's very famous for wrongly predicting the 2016 election, right? And he had that sense of like, oh no, what did I do? He went back and wrote a whole book about it and said, well, forecasts take place in organizations and they're very social, and there's maybe a tendency for people, the forecasters themselves, the computer scientists or the quants on Wall Street to confirm the biases of their bosses. There are still these kind of social hierarchies. And so the technologies are good, but the social environments in which they're hatched and in which they're sort of propagated, that those are bad, or there are some sort of pathologies associated with the organizations themselves that cause good forecasts to be ignored and bad forecasts to be sort of piled onto and supported and confirmed and move forward. So, anyways.
No, I think that's a very important, almost more sort of ontological point. I'll make a one that I think goes along with that, sometimes complementary, sometimes in tension. That's a little more epistemological. But just to go back to the teleological question, I think once it's hard enough to predict the past, right? Which is kind of, that's what I try to do, and I try to leave the future to others that are smarter. I would say there is a teleology until the moment precisely that you mentioned of the post-war, when there's just a fracturing that leads us to a present where there's just a lot more of everything. One way to tell that story is through the very meanings of the word data across time. So data etymologically is a past participle, right? Of the verb to give. So in antiquity, data refers to known knowns. It's something that is in the past, it's a given, it's ascertainable. It then evolves to describe the basis for geometric proofs in medieval world, in early modernity. In the 18th century, it refers to just observed reality, empirical facts. By the 19th century, just like the future, which starts as something that's given and becomes something humans produce, that happens to data too, right? So the positivists have a slogan, you view to preview. So if you go to the late 19th century, data now means sort of numerical aggregates collected for future use, right? This is the beginning of planning as a discipline of the administrative state. So now you're actually using data to try to foresee and to foretell, to predict population patterns, demographic growth, and so on and so forth. If you fast forward to the era in the post-war where we get expressions like data processing and so on, you have a further abstraction of the idea of data, which now references these sort of transmittable, storable computing units, bits, and so on and so forth, that feed into extraordinarily sophisticated models that do have predictive capacities that would have been unimaginable to those medievalists doing geometric proofs, right? So that is true. At the same time, the inputs are always necessarily like the data of the classical world, sort of past participles, right? I mean, a model can only operate from known knowns as a starting point, which is then a defense of the quote-unquote failures of probabilistic models, because, well, they can only work with the inputs that are available, right? So again, it's not an argument against models or against computing technologies and so on. It's just a call for sort of acknowledging the future as always an unknown unknown.
Right. I mean, that was one of the problems with the global financial crisis of 2000, 2008 is that the modelers, the quants said, you know, we were basing our projections on data, and data are always by necessity about what happened in the past. Right. And we encountered tendencies or dynamics that we hadn't seen over the last 20 years. And so our data were these past projections or the assumptions that we were making about the relationship between housing prices and interest rates, or, you know, those got turned on their heads, and we were sort of blindsided by that.
Right. And
all of our models were past looking.
Can we make sense? Right.
Right. We can only see that after the fact. Right. I want to bring up another question that relates to the sort of temporality of futuring, which is that the field of urban planning, as you say, was really a kind of late 20th century kind of invention, that the profession of planning, kind of big P planning, was really, you know, and the way we teach it in planning schools is, we often start with the progressive era in the United States, and then there was this kind of revolution, a data revolution that took place in the 1950s and 60s, and kind of knocked the socks off of what more of the design or spatial planning kind of roots of the field. And in that sense, the profession of planning really only got started kind of much later in the history that you tell. And yet you talk about this planner or that planner in the early 1800s or even in the 1700s. I guess I want to ask you sort of about the actors and agents in your stories, sort of like what's at stake in calling these folks planners when the field itself didn't really exist at the time that you were writing about, or for several of the centuries that you were writing about.
Yeah, so the planning, the field as a profession didn't exist, but the practice did, right? So I subscribe to the Kevin Lynch definition of planning as the management of change, right? But you know, the Pombal, who is behind, along with some engineers, the secular plan for Lisbon, was not a professional planner. He was a diplomat, right? Who was very sort of well versed in you know, anti-seismic technologies and water management, discourse at the time, and so on and so forth. But he is in effect managing change, right? So that's the story I tell here, right? It doesn't follow planning with a capital P, but rather just the practice of managing urban change. And I think one irony here is that as planning sort of assimilates a lot of the lessons that I've talked about and the book talks about, it's precisely when it constitutes itself as a discipline, and it's precisely when it begins to lose power, right? So sort of especially in post-war, so a lot of the lessons, and planners have assimilated, right, the lessons of mistakes of urban renewal and so on, but how much does that matter historically? Not all that much, right? So once we get to the post-war, one of the arguments I make is that if you actually take away the capital P planners that at a place like the GSD, we spend a lot of time talking about, like Le Corbusier and so on, we probably end up with something fairly similar to what we got, right? Because in this case, either through path dependence or through just a very unlikely combination of pressures and forces, the car becomes just an irresistible force for GDP growth and so on and so forth. That's a separate story.
No, but I mean, that's a huge question, right? To what extent do planners or the people who are doing the imaginative work that you write about, so beautifully, to what extent do they have any power in today's, the environment?
Even back then, so one thing that I learned by spending lots of time with primary documents was how there were all these planners and engineers who were now anonymous in the 1910s, sort of writing in publications like, The American City and so on, who just they really got it. Like they understood that you had to think at a metropolitan scale. They understood that, there was a massive storage problem for automobility and so on and so forth. They just weren't the ones who called the shots.
So who is calling the shots today? I mean, I guess I have an interest because I study financial markets and their connection to cities and built environments. And I'm actually writing a book about sort of capital's radical imaginary. So interviewing all of these quants and forecasters and people who would not call themselves planners, but they're working for real estate investors. Right? And so they are thinking a lot about the future. You could say that there's even more investment in the work they do than in all the sort of city planners dispersed across the world, because I think that's something we've kind of ignored, the extent to which the private sector also imagines the future. And they have engaged, or they've invested in this massive sort of predictive apparatus and new prop tech businesses and companies that are using AI to anticipate what property values are going to do in the future, and which cities and which parts of cities are going to rapidly develop and rapidly decline. So, all along when we're talking about planners with the big P, I'm saying there's also this sort of set of individuals, organizations, and entities that are also engaged in a kind of race to the future. And in many ways, they're getting there first. They're claiming the future. They're capturing the future with their models and being able to kind of increase the value of their assets today in the present. So it's not just about imaginaries and visions and this sort of the act of futuring, but it's also about having possession over the kinds of market devices and tools that allow the visionaries and their organizations to claim those futures, to actively sort of act. I mean, you could even say that like the property right, the ability to own property is the ability to capture its future value, or options contracts that are very common in the world of real estate development and investment. You're saying in insurance policies, it's not just the imaginaries. It's also the, these kinds of tools that allow you to really affect the future, to influence, but also, sadly, to kind of capture and confiscate it, and to kind of get there first in what you could see as a potential sort of race to the future. And you talk about this to some extent when you talk about technology, because these are private companies, the railroads and the telegraph, and these were not public entities. So we have the private companies sort of engaging and creating kind of sort of technologies of the future. I guess I'm wondering what you see that sort of interplay between public and private being today.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's also all over the book. I mean, I showed you some images. There's over 60 illustrations. So it's just a flavor and a taste of what's in the book. And one of them is a caption of the Metropolis of Tomorrow, the responses to New York zoning code, and sort of form follows the law, right? Tax code shapes the future of urbanization in all kinds of ways in this story too. So one, I can't wait to read your book. It's going to be wonderful.
If I ever have time to write it, but sure, finish it.
We'll still be here. So just sort of two stories that show, I think, different facets of what you just described. One, again, to go back to automobility. In the 1920s, the imagination from engineers to science fiction authors really can't envision anything outside of mass transit, right? Everybody sort of assumes that collective transportation is here onto the future. Cars had a competitive advantage in that they could use public infrastructure, unlike streetcars, without regulation and without sort of paying for concessions, right? So you could park anywhere and there was no mechanism to charge for that. That wasn't enough for their victory. I think for cars to become as overwhelming as they did in post-war, it really took the redirecting of industrial capacity built during wartime towards the construction of suburban infrastructure. That's the story. Didn't really imagine didn't matter what people were imagining, right? The material conditions were so powerful and forceful that they kind of overdetermined what we ended up getting, right? So that's one story. Now, the story of capital and how it moves, I really also think is contingent, and we sort of have to start from the conditions and not from the theory. To just point blank answer the question of who calls the shots in a place like Massachusetts, it's homeowners, and homeowners as investors, right? So one arc here that is fairly particular to the United States, this is not the case in Lagos, the last case study, for example, is that whereas in second half of the 19th century, you made money from building, the Astors built their fortunes that way and so on. In the second half of the 20th century in the United States, you make money from not building, right? From essentially suppressing new housing through zoning codes and other kinds of strategies. And again, if you're a homeowner, an investor, your property then becomes a vehicle to build and grow equity and so on and so forth, right? So again, I think it's always contingent, and it depends on the actual conditions.
Great.
Yeah.
You have a very impressive understanding of these kinds of dynamics and contemporary world as well as historically. And again, I think that's what really enriches the book. I think now we are intended to turn to you all and to the folks online to field some questions for Bruno, or I will sort of stay in the back.
Please, for Rachel too.
But I want you, before we start, just to be conscious of taking up too much time. Your question should really be a question. It should end with a question mark. And if you could, when you ask your question, please state your name and if you'd like your affiliation. And we do have some mics circulating around the room. So, Carol?
Thank you, Bruno, for your talk. My name is Carol Vulgaris. I'm an associate professor in the urban planning program. You've talked about the difficulty of predicting the future and how many predictions prove to be wrong in one way or another. I wonder if you could also comment on the idea of sort of the doomsday sort of Cassandra sort of self-defeating prophecies, where the reason this prediction didn't come true is because we were warning of disaster and we took action and prevented that. And the difficulty of imagining sort of the counterfactual, we can never know if those doomsday prophecies were true or not, and how those types of maybe less optimistic, how those types of predictions have also shaped our built environments.
Oh yes, I mean absolutely, and the I mean the book is full of those stories too, where doomsdayism can be paralyzing, right? But where an imagination of where things can go awry either builds antibodies or sort of prepares responses that then keep it from happening. I mean, I think a lot about the people who stood in negative 30 degrees in Minnesota with their whistles and didn't fall into the trap of overreacting and justifying what might have happened, and we'll never know, right? We never know what kinds of futures became foreclosed, when those people stood there in the cold. I make an argument for counterfactuals in the epilogue in all kinds of other directions too. I mean, I think one mental habit that we got from overlearning historical lessons is that we put the new under much greater scrutiny than the status quo. I mean, we see this, with the kinds of environmental criteria that we apply to new construction, often not considering how people get to new buildings and not to older housing stock, which tends to be more energy efficient and so on. But I also make the argument that historians have sort of told the story of urbanization by focusing on the price paid by progress, and that's extraordinarily important. I do that too. I did it in my previous book. But we should ask, as a counterfactual, how the poor of Paris would have fared without the Haussmannian reforms. And I think that there's a very good case for them not having fared as well as they did with them. Which is not an answer to the question, but just, riding the counterfactual train.
Great. Jeff in the back.
Thanks. My name's Jeff Rosenblum. I focus on transportation planning. So a thought about that I'd like to get your thoughts on is predictions that really are based on assumptions, and those assumptions are social, political, economic.
Yeah.
And that one of the things that happens is those all get hidden in the prediction process. And one thing that some professional planners focus on that I've been pushing and others is scenario planning, where you bring the assumptions more daylighted to the public and to other decision makers so that it's not this black box. So wondering what your thoughts are on, instead of saying we are predicting the future, we are saying, if we do this, then these things might happen. And so there's more of a connection between agency and the future rather than just, oh, this is the direction things are going.
No, I think that's fantastic. I was in a dissertation committee with Samuel Tabori at the GSD, who was an enthusiast of scenario planning. And absolutely, and I think that's the kind of uses of prediction that can expand our sense of the possible, make us more alert and more capable to adapt to shifts that we're not capable of anticipating, right? So again, an argument that just because there are unknown unknowns doesn't mean we should throw our hands up in the air and not engage in this kind of exercise. It's just that we should do it more in those directions than in ones that assume more than they should, right?
Yeah, and in many ways, the best plans aren't the sort of crystal balls, but
Yes,
they're the ones
that's right.
they're frameworks that could maybe work well under multiple scenarios.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, we do see examples of very successful planning.
Yes.
And I don't want to,
absolutely. Yeah.
you know.
Open-ended, yeah,
Yes.
and even in the past, right? So here, the story of the late 19th century, there's a certain planning tradition that was very teleological and that sort of understood that technological shifts in communications, building, and mobility kind of changed the world as we knew them, right? Now you have to plan for the telegraph, you have to plan for rail. But some thought that you could plan for posterity. Once you fix these problems, we're done, sort of, Le Corbusier was of that mindset to a great extent. Others like Cerdà were not, right? They sort of knew that you had to plan,
flexible.
exactly. But they planned with more open-ended systems that could adapt to things that we couldn't assume or anticipate, right?
Yes, Hannah.
Maybe we should do 3.
Okay, all right,
That's
yes.
good.
That's okay, we'll choose a couple.
Thanks for this great conversation. I'm Hannah Teicher. I'm an assistant professor of urban planning at the GSD. So in urban planning, there's this tendency to valorize the compact urban form, which it seems you might be doing here. I'm just curious what you say about, the vast amount of our territory that is suburban and how and whether the suburbs could also be a solution.
Great, yeah.
Yes, over here.
Hi, I'd like to, my question is...
Your name?
I'll get to that.
Yeah.
I just want to tell you my question before so you know that it's coming. The question is about the distinction between planning and management. And my name is Barbara Thornton. My background is degree in city planning, degree in business. I've gone back to writing about specifically Orange County, California, and the post-war era of development in that area, and what happened the 20 years right after the war. And when I got my city planning degree, I thought that sort of a Lewis Mumford perspective, good planning would lead to good lives for people, that was the solution. And I went through that with most of my career. Until I started looking more closely, and the corruption in cities is a real problem. And I don't know if there are mayors in the room, but looking from the perspective of a city manager, which is more prevalent in California, and mayors, you don't know when you're going to have a great city and a great plan and a corrupt police department. And how do you balance that into the overall equation that we want to get to have a better city?
Yeah.
Okay, one more question.
I am a student in Kennedy School, a mid-career from India. And my question is, going from the history of 300 years, which you have covered in the book, what the cities in Global South can learn from that? Because the pace of...
Can learn from what? Sorry.
The Global South.
Global South. So the pace of urbanization is happening over there, which is unprecedented. Population is enormous, and how technology currently, which is changing, would impact the cities. Because if AI is changing the way in which we work or where we work, so how they can plan for the future, which is going to be in the global south.
So we've got 3 questions, one about compact urban form, one about the relationship between plans and their political contexts, and then sort of applications in the global south.
Yes. Is this the last round?
No, we have until 1:15, so we've got
Okay, well, we'll see.
And we have some questions online.
Right. And for more, please refer to the book. It's long for a reason. There's a lot to be said about all of this. So the book tells the story of suburban dreams, sort of avant la lettre too, before we use the word to describe. So all the way from the 18th century, all the very kind of legitimate dreams of leaving cities. It goes even further back to a world where the other of the urban wasn't the rural. The rural and the urban have always been interdependent, but was rather the nomadic, right? So all the ways in which you sort of fixate your relationship to space and peoples and environments through urbanization, and how intertwined those stories are. Tells the story of 19th century suburban dreams that were about leaving the city and sort of starting new self-sufficient utopias. And then it tells the story of suburban sprawl in the United States and parts of the Anglophone world, and then globally, including the global south in more recent times. And I mean, that I just don't want to say before referring you to the book is that of course, there's very good reasons to prefer a detached home and suburban living. It's very hard to justify the kinds of direct and indirect subsidies that suburban lifestyles have received in this country. I think especially in the present of climate change, right? Just given how much more economic advantageous compact cities are from the perspective of energy, but also the perspective of land use, right? A big box is a death sentence to butterflies and migrating birds, right? And they, of course, incentivize forms of mobility that are just much more energy intensive than walking or trains and so on. So again, it's not a moral case against the suburbs, I think, for planners to want to incentivize compact living. And again, here, I think it's just, in this country, most places it's actually illegal to build with a compact fabric. And that's, I think, just completely absurd, right? So that's not a case against suburbs. It's a case for giving people choices and alternatives to pursue the lifestyles that they most want to. I think that is something that, most of us should probably agree on, regardless of what our personal preferences might be. Yes, corruption, management, I mean, we won't have time to say all that much. We also have this great progressive era institution of the manager here in our very own Cambridge. One problem, again, to sort of stay with the counterintuitive that I know lots of economists are much better versed on, is the problem of when in sort of high accountability societies, you institute very stringent anti-corruption mechanisms and you save $1 in corruption but end up spending $100 in waste. That's a very serious problem in California too. So I think we have to sort of balance how we have these conversations, basing how we assess them on outcomes, right? So I think planners should never be too possessive about outcomes, but yet we should assess the value of how we govern based on outcomes. I don't think these are actually contradictory thoughts at all, even though they might be sometimes in tension with each other. So, I mean, there's so much to be said about your question that I will unfortunately also say, the book does have quite a bit to say. I mean, it turns to a perspective from the global south right as the global north sort of takes off. And there's a great quote in 1848 from a Viennese publication. What was inconceivable yesterday becomes reality today and history tomorrow. they're referring to political volatility, but they could be referring to technological innovation, and they could be referring to the impacts of this global north boom on the global south with the intensification of imperialism, colonization, and so on. From the perspective of the present, we have governance legacies that make it extraordinarily difficult to manage and govern a megalopolis, namely the mismatch between jurisdictions and the actual issues, right? How does a municipality comprising of 5 million people manage a transit system comprising of 20, 25 million people is one major problem. The other thing I'll say is that, you know, we might think of this sort of progression, if you focus on the global north in the history of cities, to think very diagrammatically, since we have some GSDers here. We might think that in the beginning, cities have infrastructures, that we have people as infrastructures, right? So people are carrying sewage in a slave-based society, and they're dumping it on the ground, right? People are carrying others, some are being carried, some carry, and so on and so forth. And then as we get to the 19th century, you have infrastructure before people. So we have that sort of capturing of capital and sort of inside trading, so to speak, where you buy some land because you know some public utility will be extended, the value flips, boom, you've made a killing, right? This happens all over from Naples to Queens and so on. And then in the global south, you have another phenomenon, which is people before infrastructure, where people overwhelm the capacity of cities to host them, and you have the only future that we can know with certainty today, which is the future of self-built cities as a major problem to tackle, of massive housing shortages, of infrastructures that simply cannot attend to the demands of people that have moved from the countryside to cities for better opportunities, for futures that could not have been assigned to them where they come from in pursuit of opportunities and so on. So from the contemporary perspective, rather than a rough progression, these instances all coexist, often in very close geographic proximity, right? So the book ends with the case studies of Eco Atlantic and Makoku in Lagos. And there, the future is not something that might happen in 100 years if you're in Makoku. The future is the person that you see in a car, because that's the future you want for yourself. You want to be able to be within a world where you can access these services, these lifestyles, these technologies, and so on and so forth, right? Which introduces all kinds of complexities and possibilities that, again, we will not have time for. But just as a little hint, I think, of how the book tries to think about your question, and thank you.
We can take a few
all
more
these
questions.
great questions.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Jeremiah Ellison, former Minneapolis City Council member and current Loeb Fellow. Thank you for this. Has been really a great talk. I'm interested in talking about politics as well a little bit as somebody who's worked in local government. And you know, when we talk about the future, I feel like we ride this fine line of slipping into talking about almost like futurism concepts almost by accident. And you know, when I grew up, it was like almost common. It was like a common, you know, vernacular to say, "Oh, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it." Yeah. And then, yet, as I've gotten older, this concept that ignore the past, into the future, into the future, into the future, is just become more and more common among professionals. And it just dawns on me how much it sounds like, you know, the Marinetti shedding the dead hand of the past, which is this very sort of fascist ideology.
Yeah.
Do we sort of, you know, I think when we think about authoritarians, we think about the people at the top. Do we sort of accidentally educate ourselves into becoming little fascists when we're teaching planners and everybody to let go of the dead hand of the past and venture into the future?
It's an intense question.
Yeah.
I have one more in line that's maybe similar because they mentioned, we have a question from Washington Fajardo, who is interested in how the institution of private property sort of prevents us from moving forward with any kind of ambitious futuring kind of strategy. And he says at the end, are we condemned to private property, or put another way, with what urban model will we colonize the moon or Mars? So maybe also kind of getting to this, the future is completely unwritten, and maybe we need to just sort of ditch these institutions like private property that haven't entirely served us well, and think in more sort of a more sort of fantastical register. And then the last question is, who do you think will be the dominant actors in the cities of the future? Politicians, planners, or the citizens?
Yeah, I mean, for the last one, ask me again in a couple hundred years. So I'll start with Washington's one. I mean, so London didn't pull off what Lisbon did after its 1666 fires, precisely because property made it too difficult to sort of coordinate a rebuilding along different lines, right? So that's a very old story. It's a tough starting point for rethinking property regimes, given just how entrenched interests have become. I will mention, just because we talked about taxation, but not too much, and we also have not talked about Ebenezer Howard, who's a major protagonist in this book and in planning and urban history. And one aspect of Ebenezer Howard that gets sort of lost, so the Garden City is sort of his thing, right? And it was a pitch as much as a plan, and it sort of gained an afterlife throughout the world. Everywhere you turn, there's a Garden City, but became a vehicle to sort of segregate cities, and it ran away from something that was crucial to Howard, which was the sort of the Henry George idea that we could begin to reform the hold of property regimes in how we exist in a city through land value taxation, right? So sort of in a nutshell,
a shared ownership.
Or so there was a shared ownership model. Yeah, so it depends on the when and which texts, but yes, very much. Well, it gets complicated, but I'll just sort of in a nutshell for those unfamiliar with this idea. I mean, the idea is that the way we tax now through sales taxes and income taxes, we socialize individual value, right? So you work as a painter, you work as an accountant. We tax your salary, we're socializing what you produced. But that rather, one way through which to diminish the role of property owners in how we govern cities is to, instead of taxing you for your value, we tax the land. Because there, the value is socialized. Land is more valuable if it's in a city rather than if it's not accessible. So then we turn the private ownership value there, and we socialize it by taxing the land, right? So that's not really an answer to Washington. Well, it's sort of an answer, so I'll state that. And then, I mean, Marinetti, and that's a whole separate, conversation, which should probably happen offline. But I will say one more lesson we haven't quite yet talked about that I think is probably more obvious today than when I wrote the book. Which is, so one, I should say that what I call modern here is just an orientation towards the future, right? So it's trying to think of how people imagine the futures as planners, as futurists, as visionaries, but also as individuals who are peasants and move to a city and can now entertain a set of possibilities that had been impossible as the sons of cobblers or enslaved people or women or whatever they might have been before that move and before that future became something entertainable. Now, we became sort of accustomed, I think, in the last 10, 15, 20 years to imagine that progressives have a monopoly on the imagination, when historically fascists have very fertile minds too. Think fascists, think Nazis. And I think that not keeping that lesson front and center has not been a great idea.
And politicians, planners, and citizens.
Yeah, so that one, again, I'm going to embargo that. In 400 years, I'll
Well, Bruno, I think you've stimulated this really interesting and kind of really expansive conversation about I mean, so many different topics. Yeah, I mean, I can't even begin to list all the sort of the places we have visited in the last hour and 15 minutes, not just places, but really important intellectual and policy constructs. And, you know, your book just really does a valiant job of tying all of this together. So it's a wild romp, and I highly recommend it. I know this is not purely a book talk, but you got us talking about really interesting things and things that we don't always talk about in policy and planning world. So it really takes a humanist and a humanities scholar, you know, somebody who's so well versed in literature and film and sort of that kind of interpretive critique of the cultural objects to get us talking about all of these kinds of bigger issues. So I really thank you for that. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for a very interesting conversation. And of course, thank Jorrit and the Bloomberg Center for hosting us and for asking us to engage in this conversation. I think it's really been wonderful, and I'm looking forward to, you know, continuing the conversation in the future. So I'll end on that word. So please join me in thanking everybody, including yourselves.
Thank you.
Wonderful.